Alright, welcome back. Shaw versus Reno. Alright, and our learning objective here, the context in which we want to consider this document, is that the Republican ideal in the U.S. is manifested in the structure and operation of the legislative branch. So we're talking about congressional representation here. So what were the facts of this case? What happened? Well, North Carolina created a very bizarrely shaped majority-minority district for the purpose of increasing black representation in Congress. So this is an interesting case because this is clearly gerrymandering. That very bizarrely shaped tells us that. But what they did was they essentially tried to lump a bunch of neighborhoods that were predominantly African American together with the goal of increasing minority representation in Congress. So this is what's known as a majority-minority district. The majority of people in that district were minorities. And this was brought as a lawsuit against the state of North Carolina for doing that. So North Carolina feels like they're good because they increased minority representation. But did they go too far in the way that they drew this particular district, is the question. Well, your ultimate question is, does a racially gerrymandered district violate the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause? So we know that gerrymandering is allowed. There are some limits on it. But this district appears to be gerrymandered for racial purposes and no other purposes. So does the fact that it was gerrymandered for race specifically violate the Equal Protection Clause? And the Supreme Court rules that congressional districts cannot be drawn based only on race. You might be able to see there the difficulty of what's going to happen with this. Saying that something is done only based on race is a tough thing to prove. But in this case, the Supreme Court felt that there was no other reasonable explanation for why the districts would have been drawn this way. So they were drawn based on race only. Therefore, that was an unconstitutional gerrymander that was taking place here. And the principle that they used from the Constitution to support this decision was that drawing congressional districts based only on race violated the Equal Protection Clause and opposes the colorblind ideal of U.S. law. All right, there's actually a lot to unpack in that short little sentence. So we have where gerrymandering is allowed. So you can draw it to help incumbents, you can draw it to help your party, you can draw it to do all these different things. But now we're saying, well, doing it based only on race is not allowed. And we're saying that it violates the Equal Protection Clause. This is interesting as well because we know that the Equal Protection Clause was created essentially to protect minorities, right? And in this case, this is an example of it actually kind of going in the other direction, where this is saying that this violates essentially the equal protection of the majority of white people. That the U.S. Constitution is supposed to be colorblind, so it is not supposed to give account to race at all. Obviously, we know throughout our history there have been times when the government has made certain policies and decisions based on race in an effort to make things more equal. And that's what North Carolina argued that they were doing here, is that they were trying to promote equality, but this was struck down on the basis that they were looking at race, which is therefore in violation of the Equal Protection Clause. All right, so essentially what this quote from the majority opinion is saying is that it says what they're objecting to is redistricting that is so extremely irregular on its face that it rationally can be viewed only as an effort to segregate the races for purposes of voting. So creating white districts and black districts, and so that's not going to be allowed. It says without regard for traditional districting principles and without sufficiently compelling justification. So the first sentence is telling us that they are not, so there's like double negatives going on here, saying never has held that something is impermissible in all circumstances. So it's saying that they're not saying that you can't look at race at all. So state legislatures, when they redistrict, they can still look at race. They can be race conscious, but it can't be so extreme that you could look at it as saying the only reason for that was because of race. So therefore, because they felt like this district could not be justified on any grounds besides race, that this violated the Equal Protection Clause and was unconstitutional. Additionally, majority opinion says that the 14th Amendment requires that if you're going to make this kind of distinction among people between races, it be narrowly tailored to further a compelling government interest. That means that if you do have to make a law or policy that treats people differently on the basis of race, you must have the law must be written as narrowly as possible. So it must be something that's not broad, something that can't apply to multiple other things, something that can only be taken literally as exactly it is written. And there has to be a really strong, compelling government interest. The government needs to step in, otherwise people would be discriminated against, kind of a thing. For the dissent, it's here going to point out the fact that this is going to negatively harm minority representation. And if you go on to read, it says that North Carolina's plan, in which whites remain a majority in a disproportionate number of congressional districts, so apparently white voters were still disproportionately overrepresented in the state even with this district. And it says how it gives you just historical fact of the state having just sent its first black representative to Congress since Reconstruction, so a long, long time, 100 years plus. He says how that could have possibly violated white people's constitutional rights is both a fiction and a departure from settled equal protection principles. So this is, they are alleging that this is a new interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause, which it surely is, and we're going to see in other cases how this will be applied in the future. But essentially this is just pointing out, hey, white people are still overrepresented, black people are still underrepresented in the state and in Congress, and the way the Equal Protection Clause has always been interpreted until now, there'd be nothing wrong with this district. Alright, remember, subscribe, hit that like button for me if this video helped you out at all. Till next time, this has been a La Money production.